Hello everybody. This is lesson 19 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slides 69 to 86 of chapter 3 Currency Politics. In this lesson we will analyze the functioning of fixed exchange rate systems based on the historical example of the so-called Bretton Woods system. During the period between the two world wars, international trade was restrained by protectionist measures of most countries, especially by currency exchange controls. One consequence of this was that the volume of international trade between the two world wars did not return to the level reached before World War I in 1914. After the Second World War, the international community agreed, therefore, in an initiative of the United States in the year 1944 to form a system of fixed exchange rates, the so-called Bretton Woods system. One of the leading economists of the Bretton Woods Conference, who contributed with his ideas to the foundation of the Bretton Woods system, was John Maynard Keynes. This diagram is quite useful to get an idea how much the build-up of trade barriers during the so-called Great Depression brought world trade to a standstill between the two world wars. The per capita GDP of the 14 leading industrialized countries at the time is measured in this diagram on the y-axis here. The industrial exports of these countries are measured on the x-axis as a percentage of GDP. This is called the export quota. The green line now shows the development of the average per capita GDP and the average share of industrial exports in percent of GDP of these 14 leading industrialized countries. As you can clearly see, the export quota had decreased significantly from 1980, when the Smoot-Hawley Act was passed in the USA, to the year 1939, when the Second World War began. The Second World War then brought, as usual in a wartime, a further decrease of the export quota to this level here. After the end of World War II, the quota rose again over the long term, together with the level of per capita GDP in these countries. Let's first have a look how the Bretton Woods system was constructed. The exchange rate of all participating countries against the US dollar was fixed. For example, the dollar-Deutsche Mark exchange rate was fixed at the level of 0.27 dollar for one Deutsche Mark. Each currency was allowed to fluctuate around this fixed exchange rate within a band of plus minus 1%. Every central bank has to keep care that this bandwidth is respected. In return, the US Central Bank accepts the obligation to exchange dollar claims from foreign central banks of the Bretton Woods system at a price of $35 per ounce of gold at any time wanted. The system existed in this way until the American President Richard Nixon unilaterally cancelled the US dollar obligation to pay for gold in the year 1971. How did it come to this event? The system ran into difficulties when the United States, under the Johnson government, increased its government expenditure for welfare state programs and the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s and financed this through borrowing. The rise in credit demand by the US government caused a rise in dollar interest rates. As a result, private consumption and investment goods demand in the United States started to fall, since consumption demand and investment goods demand are typically negatively influenced by the interest rate. If the interest rate goes up, consumption goes down, and investment goes down also. To prevent that from happening, the United States Central Bank increased money supply. The increased money supply caused then the dollar interest rates to decrease again. As a result, private demand stayed unchanged, while the government demand for goods was growing. This caused excess demand, which caused an overheating of the US economy, so that in the long run the US price level started to grow. This combination of expansionary fiscal and monetary policy caused the price level in the United States to grow stronger than the price levels in the member states of the Bretton Woods system during the 1960s. As a result, the purchasing power parity relationship was permanently disturbed. So, goods in the United States were more expensive as, for example, German goods. Therefore, Americans demanded steadily more goods in the other member states as other member states did in the United States. As a result, dollar supply grew stronger than dollar demand. Thus, a steady tendency of the dollar depreciation resulted as a consequence. So the demand-driven increase of the dollar price level caused a demand for the currencies of the other member states, for example the Deutsche Mark, such that the dollar depreciated against the Deutsche Mark, which means the Deutsche Mark appreciated against the dollar, according to the purchasing power parity equation which we have already derived. Since the central banks of the member states had the obligation to keep their currency exchange rate versus the dollar within a stable bandwidth, they had to fight this steady appreciation tendency of their own currencies. As the following graphs demonstrate, this forced, for example, the German Bundesbank to buy again and again United States dollar. This diagram represents the foreign exchange market between the Deutsche Mark and the US dollar. We measure on the y-axis the exchange rate dollar per Deutsche Mark and on the x-axis the trade volume in Deutsche Mark. We assume that in the initial situation the equilibrium exchange rate equals the fixed exchange rate between dollar and Deutsche Mark according to the Bretton Woods Treaty, which was 0.27 dollar for one Deutsche Mark. As we have already analyzed on slide 26 of this chapter, see lesson 16, due to the price increase in the United States, goods in Germany became cheaper from the US perspective. This increased then the demand for Deutsche Mark. So the demand curve shifts as a result to the right. This in turn caused the exchange rate of the Deutsche Mark against the dollar to appreciate. At the same time, American goods became more expensive for Germans. This caused then a decrease of the Deutsche Mark supply on the exchange market. So the Deutsche Mark supply shifts to the left, which caused in turn a further appreciation of the Deutsche Mark. Thus, a tendency of Deutsche Mark appreciation over the fixed exchange rate determined by the Bretton Woods Treaty resulted. This would be the new equilibrium exchange rate, which in this situation is above the fixed exchange rate. So, given the higher inflation rate in the United States, a tendency of an appreciation of the Deutsche Mark and a depreciation of the US dollar resulted. Since the Deutsche Bundesbank had the obligation to fight any appreciation of the Deutsche Mark dollar exchange rate above the fixed exchange rate by more than 1%, it had to buy dollar on the foreign exchange market and increasing thereby the supply of Deutsche Mark. In order to depreciate again the Deutsche Mark exchange rate as a result of this intervention. These permanent foreign exchange interventions in favor of the dollar had two consequences. First, the central banks of the member states accumulated huge amount of dollars. Second, since the interventions did not allow the dollar exchange rate to depreciate, but caused it to remain close to its fixed level, the prices for goods of the other member state countries remained cheap from the American perspective. To remember, demand-side inflationary pressure caused American prices to grow. As a result, American prices for goods were higher than European prices, for example, the prices of German goods, given the fixed exchange rate. Now, the resulting additional demand for Deutsche Mark caused first the exchange rate of the Deutsche Mark against the dollar to appreciate. However, then the central bank intervention of the Deutsche Bundesbank caused again the exchange rate to depreciate back to its fixed level. The result of this Bundesbank intervention was therefore that the inequality of the purchasing power parity equation simply stayed, which means American prices stayed more expensive than European prices. So this disequilibrium did not disappear because of these foreign exchange market interventions of the German Bundesbank. Accordingly strong was the US demand for goods of other member states. Thus, the resulting permanent excess demand caused the prices of the member states to grow finally also. This way, the high inflation rates in the United States were transferred to the other member states of the Bretton Woods system. This is what we call import of inflation. This example shows in a fixed exchange rate system, the inflation rates of the member states adjust in the long run to the inflation rate of the key currency. What did now finally cause the collapse of the Bretton Woods system? Well, since the United States Central Bank increased its money supply without increasing at the same time its gold reserves, the dollar reserves of the other member states reached levels significantly higher than the United States gold reserves. Since by the end of the 60s, the market price for gold was higher than $35 per ounce, at which the American Central Bank had to sell its gold, there was a strong incentive to sell dollar reserves to the American Central Bank for gold and resell the gold on the free market. France took the first step in 1969 and wanted to sell all its dollar reserves to the Federal Reserve United States Central Bank for gold. Since the Federal Reserve did not have enough gold, as mentioned, to fulfill this demand, the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, was de facto insolvent. The United States proposal to clear the situation targeted a depreciation of the fixed dollar exchange rates. This way, the permanent intervention support for the dollar would have become redundant. However, most member states declined this proposal since such a depreciation would also have reduced the gold value of their dollar reserves. Since a mutually accepted agreement was not possible, United States President Richard Nixon cancelled the United States obligation to exchange gold for dollar reserves in the year 1971. And this caused then the final break of the Bretton Woods system in the year 1973. This break of the Bretton Woods system started a period of flexible exchange rate for the global economy. The European Union countries limited the volatility of their exchange rate by the introduction of the so-called currency snake in the year 1973. In the year 1979, the European exchange rate mechanism was founded that led for most countries to the European Monetary Union by the year 1999. So much for this lecture. In the next lesson, I will talk about various possibilities for private companies to protect themselves against exchange rate risks that can result under the conditions of a flexible exchange rate system.